Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are your instructors for the day, and you are getting a front row seat to a masterclass in enterprise accountability.
We are really thrilled you decided to join us for this session.
Yeah, especially because we know you're likely, prepping for a major organizational review or looking to sharpen your governance frameworks. Or maybe you're just insanely curious about how the biggest enterprises in the world keep their incredibly complex technology systems from falling apart at the seams.
Right. It's a massive undertaking.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're looking at a stack of incredibly rigorous, globally recognized source material. Specifically, we are diving deep into the IT Audit Framework, or ITF 5th edition.
Published by ISACA.
Exactly, published by ISACA. And as you probably already know, ISACA is this massive global community that has spent, more than 50 years advancing digital trust.
The ITAF document is essentially the gold standard playbook for IT audit and assurance practitioners.
And our overarching theme for this deep dive is Chapter 4 of this framework, which covers reporting standards.
But we aren't just skimming the surface here.
No, definitely not. Our specific lesson plan for today is a sequential, highly detailed exploration of Reporting Standard 1402 and its accompanying reporting guidelines 2402.
And these sections deal entirely with one critical, often overlooked, and highly contentious phase of an audit: follow-up activities.
Yes, the follow-up.
What's fascinating here is that even within mature IT organizations, we often see this persistent cognitive bias, where the issuance of the final audit report is viewed as the finish line.
Oh, absolutely. The feeling of we made it.
Right. You bring in the experts, they evaluate your systems, they run their vulnerability scans, they review your access controls, they hand you this massive PDF detailing all your control deficiencies.
And everyone just breathes a sigh of relief because the field work is finally over.
Exactly. But from the perspective of the ITF 5th edition, the issuance of that report is really just the opening argument of the most important phase. The source material makes it unequivocally clear that an audit is completely useless if nothing is ever verified as fixed.
Completely useless.
The follow-up activities outlined in Standard 1402 are the ultimate accountability mechanism in business, technology, and governance. Without a rigorous follow-up process, those expensive, highly disruptive audits are essentially just academic exercises that produce filing cabinet filler.
Filing cabinet filler. I love that. And if you're auditing an enterprise that just survived a massive ransomware scare because of an unpatched VPN vulnerability, finding that issue isn't the victory.
No, it's just the diagnosis.
Right. The victory is the follow-up process that ensures the Chief Information Security Officer actually deployed the patches across all of your global endpoints before the attackers pivot to a secondary exploit.
By establishing mandatory requirements for clear, consistent, and accurate communication, ISACA ensures that vulnerabilities are actually addressed.
Verifying the fix is what actually keeps the company out of the headlines and avoids those catastrophic regulatory fines. And I think that brings us right to the foundation of the source text.
Standard 1402.
We're talking about Reporting Standard 1402. The source text breaks this down into 3 mandatory requirements. Statements 1402.1, 1402.2, and 1402.3.
And we really need to emphasize the weight of the terminology used here, because in the context of professional frameworks, words have immense legal and operational consequences.
It really do.
In the introduction to the ITAF framework, ISACA makes a very distinct differentiation between standards and guidelines.
Right. They aren't interchangeable.
Not at all. Standards are mandatory in all circumstances. When the text uses the word shall or must, it denotes a hard, non-negotiable requirement. Any deviations from a standard must be explicitly addressed, justified, and resolved before the engagement can even be considered completed.
So when we look at Statement 1402.1, which is titled Monitor and Report, it dictates that practitioners shall monitor and periodically report to those charged with governance on management's progress.
They were required to conclude if management took appropriate timely action to address the reported audit findings.
This isn't a casual suggestion to check in when you have some free time.
Definitely not. The practitioner is professionally obligated to keep an eye on the situation and formally declare to the governing body whether management actually did their job.
Think of it like a home inspection. Finding a leaky pipe or a compromised firewall is step 1. The follow-up is making sure the plumber actually fixed it before the house floods.
That's a great analogy, and Statement 1402.2 reinforces this by mandating regular reporting. The overall status of implementation must be regularly reported to the audit committee.
But let's be realistic here and talk about how this actually plays out in the wild. If you're an internal IT auditor, your paycheck is ultimately signed by executive management.
True.
And Statement 1402.3, which covers the escalation of risk acceptance, explicitly states that if management decides to accept a risk that is greater than the enterprise's risk appetite, that acceptance must be discussed with senior management. And if unresolved, escalated straight to the organization's governing body, like the board of directors.
Yes, that is the rule.
Does that level of aggressive escalation actually happen in practice? Or does it just result in the auditor getting quietly reassigned or marginalized? It feels like a massive career risk to bypass the C-suite and go straight to the audit committee.
That is the exact friction point that defines the independence of the audit function.
Hmm.
And you're entirely right. It is highly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But the framework is designed to protect the practitioner in that exact scenario.
So it's a shield.
Exactly. The reason 1402.3 is a mandatory standard and not just a guideline is because of the fiduciary duty the auditor holds to the enterprise as a whole, not to any individual executive. If the auditor discovers that management is accepting a catastrophic risk,
Like choosing not to implement multi-factor authentication on a critical financial database.
right, to save on licensing costs or whatever, and if the auditor fails to escalate that to the board,
Yeah.
the auditor themselves becomes professionally negligent. The standard provides the auditor with the necessary leverage. They aren't going to the board because they want to cause trouble. They are going to the board because Standard 1402.3 dictates that they shall do so. It removes the personal agency and replaces it with professional mandate.
The board relies on that unvarnished truth to fulfill their own oversight responsibilities.
Precisely.
Let's look at another illustrative example derived from the source material regarding these high-stakes escalations. Imagine an enterprise develops a customer-facing artificial intelligence chatbot.
Very common these days.
Right. And during the audit, the practitioner discovers that this AI chatbot was deployed without any content filtering, without strict role-based access controls for the training data, and without output monitoring.
The inherent risk there is massive. The bot could expose sensitive, personally identifiable information, produce discriminatory advice, and absolutely devastate the enterprise's reputation.
Potentially triggering massive GDPR violations. So the auditor flags this as a critical finding.
And in that scenario, if the product management team looks at that finding and says, implementing those filters and access controls will delay our time to market by 3 months, and we need to beat our competitors to launch, so we are just going to accept the risk and go live anyway.
Which happens all the time.
It does. But they're almost certainly exceeding the enterprise's predefined risk appetite. Statement 1402.3 mandates that the auditor cannot just passively accept management's dismissal of the risk.
The governing body has to know.
The people who actually carry the ultimate fiduciary and legal responsibility for the enterprise must be informed that management is essentially playing Russian roulette with the company's reputation and data for the sake of a product launch.
Another scenario the text touches on involves missing cloud application logs. If a cloud service provider is hosting your critical infrastructure, but they aren't retaining security event logs, how do you even perform forensics if you've been breached?
You can't. You're flying blind.
Right. If the chief information officer shrugs and says it costs too much to upgrade the vendor contract to the premium tier that includes log retention, that is an enterprise-threatening blind spot. The auditor is compelled by these standards to raise the alarm.
They have no choice.
So we have this intense, non-negotiable mandate. The standards tell us what we absolutely must do. So what does this all mean for the day-to-day execution? How do audit teams translate that mandate into operational reality without grinding the IT department to a halt?
That transitions us perfectly into the practical mechanics, moving from the mandatory standard 1402 into the guidelines 2402.
Specifically starting with the introduction and process definitions in 2402.1 and 2402.2.
While the standards dictate the mandatory outcomes, the guidelines offer the recommended practices for how those outcomes can be achieved to ensure consistency, quality, and rigorous methodology.
So it's the blueprint.
Yes, Guideline 2402.1 serves as the introduction, explaining that the purpose of follow-up activities is to ensure that agreed-on corrective actions are implemented in a timely, effective, and efficient manner. Or, alternatively, that the acceptance of any residual risk is appropriately approved and documented. That dual outcome is a foundational concept.
An audit finding doesn't just sit in a state of operational purgatory forever.
It cannot. It must eventually reach one of two conclusive states. Either the vulnerability is demonstrably remediated, or the enterprise officially, formally, and transparently goes on the record accepting the danger of leaving it vulnerable.
It's a binary end state. You either patch the hole in the hull or you officially document that the captain is okay with the ship taking on water.
Exactly. And Guideline 2402.2.1 actually defines what this follow-up process entails. It defines it as a process through which practitioners determine the adequacy, effectiveness, and timeliness of actions taken by management on reported observations and recommendations.
Now, the text mentions both adequacy and effectiveness. In a highly complex IT environment, what is the actual difference between an adequate fix and an effective one? Can you have one without the other?
That is a brilliant distinction to draw. And yes, you absolutely can have one without the other, which is why the guideline specifies both.
Walk us through that.
Let's use the remediation of a critical zero-day vulnerability like Log4j as an example. Management responds to the audit finding by proposing a plan to deploy the vendor-supplied patch to all affected servers. From a design perspective, that plan is adequate. It directly addresses the root cause of the vulnerability.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, during the follow-up, the auditor discovers that while the patch was pushed, it caused a catastrophic conflict with a legacy, mission-critical application. So the IT operations team quietly rolled the patch back on half the servers to keep the business running.
Oh, wow.
In that case, the action was adequate in theory, but entirely ineffective in practice, because the vulnerability still exists in the production environment. The follow-up process must evaluate not just the intention, but the operational reality.
That makes perfect sense. The adequacy is the architectural design of a solution, and the effectiveness is whether it actually survives contact with the production environment.
Precisely. And to achieve this level of rigorous evaluation, Guideline 20402.2.2 dictates that a formal follow-up process should be established to provide reasonable assurance that every review conducted by the practitioners provides optimal benefit to the enterprise.
This formalized process is what forces the organization to realize the return on investment of the audit function itself.
If we extrapolate on the absence of this formal process, the cultural degradation within the enterprise is profound.
What happens to the culture?
If an organization operates in an environment where audits are conducted, highly detailed findings are generated, and then the follow-up process is ad hoc, inconsistent, or entirely non-existent, you breed a culture of systemic negligence.
People just stop caring.
The IT engineering staff quickly realizes that the security and compliance mandates don't actually carry any weight. Management learns they can safely ignore the auditor's recommendations because no one will ever come back to check their work.
Without a formalized, rigorous, and predictable follow-up process, the entire concept of digital trust erodes from the inside out. It leaves the enterprise incredibly fragile.
It absolutely does.
Which brings us to the actual negotiation of the fix. We are looking at Guideline 2402.3, which covers getting management on board with proposed actions. Now, a vital concept to establish here is the separation of duties.
Yes, very important.
The auditor does not fix the problem. The auditor is independent and objective. Management is responsible for operations and the implementation of controls.
That separation is the bedrock of objective assurance. If the auditor designs and implements the fix, they can no longer objectively audit that specific system or process in the future.
Because they'd be auditing themselves.
Exactly. They would be evaluating their own work. This introduces a classic self-review threat to their independence, which invalidates the assurance they provide.
So what does the guideline say?
Therefore, Guideline 2402.3.1 requires that practitioners, as part of their discussions with the auditee, obtain agreement on the results of the audit and on a plan of action to improve operations. It is a structured negotiation.
The auditor presents the empirical evidence of the deficiency, and management must officially agree that the deficiency exists and warrants remediation.
Right.
But I want to push on that separation of duties for a second, because the framework strictly prohibits self-review. But in today's rapid agile and DevOps environments, where you have auditors or compliance engineers embedded directly into the development sprints to provide continuous feedback, that line between recommending a fix and designing the fix is getting dangerously blurred.
It is a very thin line.
If an embedded auditor looks at an AWS configuration during a sprint and says, your IAM policy is overly permissive, you need to restrict the S3 bucket access to this specific VPC endpoint, aren't they basically designing the control? How does Guideline 2402 handle that modern reality?
That is the defining challenge of modern IT auditing. The transition from retrospective auditing to continuous embedded assurance creates immense tension around independence.
So how do they navigate it?
The way Guideline 2402 accommodates this is through the strict documentation of ownership. Even if the embedded auditor points out the specific flaw in the IAM policy during a sprint, management, the DevOps team, or the product owner must be the ones to actually accept the risk, write the new infrastructure as code script, test it, and deploy it.
They have to own the action.
Yes. Guideline 2402.3.2 specifically covers this documentation phase. It states that the proposed actions must be provided to the practitioners and recorded as a formal management response in the final audit report, complete with the committed implementation or action date.
The auditor might have pointed them in the right direction, but management goes on the record stating, "We own this fix, we are executing this specific technical change, and we commit to having it deployed by the end of Q3.
It is entirely about the transfer and formalization of liability. By formally recording the management response and the committed timeline in the final report, the practitioner establishes a clear, indisputable baseline for accountability. It removes any operational ambiguity.
When the end of Q3 rolls around, there is no debate about what the infrastructure team was supposed to do.
None at all. And that leads directly to Guideline 2402.3.3, the initiation of procedures. Once the practitioners and the auditee come to an agreement on those proposed actions, the practitioners initiate the procedures for follow-up activities.
The stopwatch is officially ticking. Management knows that the auditors will be returning, and the criteria for success have been mutually defined.
Exactly.
But what happens when management flat out refuses to fix the issue? Here's where it gets really interesting. We are moving into the realities of Guideline 2402.4, which deals with assuming the risk.
This is a critical juncture.
Sometimes management looks at a deeply researched, highly technical finding and decides they just aren't going to do anything about it. Guideline 2402.4.1 acknowledges this harsh reality. It notes that management might decide to accept the risk of not correcting a reported condition because of the prohibitive cost, the extreme complexity of the corrective action, or other pressing operational considerations.
This raises an important question regarding governance. Who actually possesses the authority to accept massive enterprise risks just to preserve a budget or avoid a complex infrastructure migration?
Right. Can just anyone do that?
The framework is incredibly clear on this hierarchy. An IT manager, a system administrator, or even a mid-level infrastructure director cannot just quietly sweep a major vulnerability under the rug and accept the risk on behalf of the company.
That makes sense.
Guideline 2402.4.1 mandates that those charged with governance must be informed of recommendations for which management accepts the risk of not correcting the reported situation. Furthermore, the acceptance of this risk must be formally documented, officially approved by executive management, think the C-suite, and formally communicated to the governing body.
Let's frame this using a scenario that happens all the time with legacy infrastructure. Imagine an audit reveals that a legacy on-premise mainframe system is processing and storing highly sensitive medical records.
High-stakes data.
Very high. But the database itself lacks at-rest encryption, which is a clear violation of HIPAA or similar healthcare data regulations. The auditor flags this as a critical, high-impact finding.
And how does management respond?
The Chief Information Officer responds by saying, "We have evaluated the recommendation. However, the enterprise software license and the hardware upgrades required to encrypt that specific 30-year-old database architecture will cost approximately $2 million and require a 6-month freeze on all other development."
A huge undertaking.
Exactly. They say, "We do not have the capital budget or the operational bandwidth. Therefore, we are choosing to accept the risk of operating an unencrypted database."
That is a terrifying scenario for an enterprise, because a $2 million budget constraint is exposing the company to a potential multi-billion-dollar class action lawsuit and devastating regulatory sanctions in the event of a breach.
So what does the auditor do?
Guideline 2402.4.2 provides the auditor's required response to this exact situation. It dictates the procedures for the escalation of inappropriate residual risk. If the practitioners believe that the auditee has accepted a level of residual risk that is fundamentally inappropriate for the enterprise, meaning it wildly exceeds the organization's documented risk appetite and tolerance levels, they cannot just accept the CIO's answer and close the finding.
Because if they do, they are complicit in the negligence.
Precisely. The guideline states they must discuss the matter with IT audit and assurance management, usually the chief audit executive, and then with executive management like the CEO.
And if they still disagree?
If the practitioners remain in disagreement with the decision after those discussions, they, along with executive management, must report the matter directly to those charged with governance for resolution.
The board of directors or the audit committee needs to be explicitly informed of the CIO's decision.
The auditor acts as the ultimate safeguard to ensure that risk acceptance is completely transparent, vigorously debated, and ultimately approved at the absolute highest echelons of the enterprise.
Yeah.
The follow-up process is essentially a formalized negotiation of corporate liability.
The auditor is systematically removing management's ability to claim ignorance in the event of a catastrophic breach.
Exactly. It's on the record.
It is the ultimate fail-safe against short-sighted, quarter-by-quarter management decisions. So, assuming management does agree to fix the problem, and they allocate the budget and the resources, how exactly does the auditor check their work without disrupting ongoing operations?
That brings us to Guideline 2402.5.
Right, which outlines the specific step-by-step follow-up procedures practitioners use to track and evaluate these remediations. Guideline 2402.5.1 lays out 6 specific procedural steps.
It is a highly systematic, repeatable approach. Let's break down the realities of those 6 key procedures.
Let's do it.
Step 1 is to define a time frame for management to respond to each agreed-upon recommendation. This prevents the classic, "we'll put it on the roadmap for next year," evasion.
Got to have a deadline.
Step 2 is to evaluate management's response for adequacy. As we discussed earlier, does the proposed architectural fix actually solve the underlying control failure?
Adequacy versus effectiveness.
Right. Step 3 is to verify the implementation of the response when required. This means obtaining actual objective evidence, not just taking their word for it in an email.
Proof.
Step 4 is to perform additional follow-up work as necessary. Sometimes deploying a massive patch or changing a network routing protocol introduces a new, unexpected vulnerability that needs its own assessment.
You fix one thing and break another.
Exactly. Step 5 is to escalate overdue or unsatisfactory responses to the appropriate levels of management and to those charged with governance. And finally, Step 6 is to obtain formal acknowledgement from management, accepting responsibility for the associated risk when corrective action is severely delayed or ultimately will not be implemented.
Now, when you're dealing with a massive multinational enterprise that might have hundreds or even thousands of open audit findings across dozens of global business units, you cannot possibly manage these 6 steps with all their associated timelines and evidence files on a shared spreadsheet.
It would be impossible.
Guideline 2402.5.2 notes the recommendation to use an automated tracking system or database. But let's go deeper into that. We're talking about enterprise governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC platforms, right?
Yeah.
Systems like RSA Archer, ServiceNow GRC, or AuditBoard.
Absolutely. The transition from manual tick mark auditing to automated platform-driven follow-ups is one of the most significant evolutions in the profession.
How does it change the game?
The guideline recommends an automated system because the sheer volume of data and the complexity of the reporting matrices demand it. A mature GRC platform integrates the follow-up process directly into the IT service management workflows.
So it's baked into their daily operations.
Yes. When an audit finding dictates that a server needs patching, that finding automatically generates a ticket in the IT department's queuing system. The GRC platform tracks the SLA of that ticket, automatically alerts the auditor when the IT team marks it as resolved, and provides a centralized repository for the evidence upload.
It creates a single source of truth for the entire enterprise regarding the status of remediation efforts, which is critical for that final reporting to the board.
Exactly.
And the approach to these follow-ups isn't just a rigid one-size-fits-all checklist. Guideline 2402.5.3 details the factors that determine the follow-up approach, requiring the practitioner to exercise significant professional judgment based on the context of the enterprise.
There are 5 key factors to weigh.
The first factor is the significance of the findings. How critical is this vulnerability to the overall IT environment? The second factor is changes in the IT context, which I want to dive into in a second.
It's a big one.
The third is the complexity of remediation. Is this a quick registry key change or a massive infrastructure overhaul? The fourth is resource requirements, the time, capital costs, and human effort required. And the fifth is the consequence of failure. What happens to the business if their attempt to fix the issue fails entirely?
The second factor you mentioned, changes in the IT context, is perhaps the most challenging aspect for modern auditors. The technology landscape evolves so rapidly that the environment audited 6 months ago might not exist today.
Right. Let's say an audit from late last year found that physical access controls to your primary on-premise data center were weak. The biometric scanner on the main server floor was malfunctioning, and the visitor logging procedures were easily bypassed.
A classic physical security finding.
Management agreed to a finding and promised to overhaul the physical security systems by Q3. But before Q3 arrives, the enterprise accelerates its digital transformation strategy, completely decommissions that physical data center, and migrates all its mission-critical applications and data to a public cloud provider like AWS or Azure.
In that scenario, the IT context has fundamentally, permanently changed. The original recommendation repairing a biometric scanner on a physical door is now completely irrelevant because the physical room no longer holds the enterprise's data.
The risk moved.
The follow-up approach must dynamically adapt to this new reality. The auditor wouldn't just march to the empty server room, verify the scanner is still broken, and report to the board that management failed to remediate the finding.
That would be ridiculous.
Instead, the practitioner must recognize that the underlying risk unauthorized access to critical systems has shifted from physical to logical. The finding regarding the physical door is technically closed due to obsolescence, but it is immediately superseded by a critical need to evaluate the new cloud provider's physical security attestations, like their SOC2 reports, as well as the enterprise's new logical access controls over their cloud tenant environment.
The practitioner uses their professional judgment to adjust the follow-up activities to match the current living reality of the IT landscape.
Exactly. Furthermore, to ensure the audit function has the authority to make these judgment calls and pursue these issues, Guideline 2402.5.4 establishes that the overarching responsibility for follow-up actions, reporting, and escalation must be explicitly defined in the audit charter itself.
The charter is the foundational governance document approved by the board, giving the auditors the absolute right to demand answers.
It's their mandate.
Which brings us to a massive point of friction between auditors and IT management: timelines. We are looking at Guideline 2402.6, which is entirely focused on the scheduling of follow-up activities.
This is where things get heated.
If you tell an infrastructure engineering team that they need to fix a vulnerability, but you don't define a strict deadline, and you don't tell them when you're coming back to verify the fix, we both know human nature dictates that the work is never getting done.
Right. There's no urgency.
IT teams are constantly underwater, prioritizing the operational fires burning right in front of them today, not the audit finding due sometime in the future. But on the flip side, if you give them 6 months to fix a critical, actively exploited zero-day vulnerability, your enterprise is dead in the water.
That tension is exactly why Guideline 2402.6.1 emphasizes a highly risk-based approach to scheduling. Decisions on the timing of follow-up activities must consider the significance of the reported findings and the effect on the enterprise strategy if corrective actions are not taken.
It requires the auditor to weigh the severity of the threat against the realistic operational constraints of the IT department.
You do not wait 6 months to check if a critical internet-facing firewall vulnerability was patched. You might require daily updates and schedule the formal follow-up the very next week.
But for smaller things.
Conversely, if the finding is a minor documentation error regarding the annual review of a low-risk policy manual, scheduling the follow-up for the next quarter is entirely appropriate and respects the IT team's workload.
And Guideline 2482.6.2 makes a vital point about the integration of these activities. It dictates that follow-up activities are an integral part of the IT audit process, meaning they shouldn't be treated as an administrative afterthought or an extracurricular activity for the audit team.
They must be scheduled alongside regular audit steps, and the timing is directly influenced by the degree of difficulty, the risk involved, and the actual time needed to implement the fix.
If management has to procure, architect, install, and configure an entirely new enterprise identity and access management solution to resolve an access control finding, you cannot reasonably schedule your follow-up for next Tuesday.
No, you have to build the follow-up schedule around a realistic, multi-phase implementation timeline.
However, when dealing with severe vulnerabilities, that timeline must forcefully compress. Guideline 2402.6.3 explicitly addresses high-risk issues. It directs practitioners to follow up on agreed-on outcomes relating to high-risk issues soon after the due date for action, and suggests they may need to monitor them on a regular recurring basis after the due date.
The auditor must be a persistent, undeniable presence when the enterprise's core digital trust is on the line. To manage this potentially overwhelming workload, Guideline 2402.6.4 offers different operational approaches to coordinating the follow-ups.
Like batch processing.
Yes. Sometimes an audit department will operate in batches. For example, every quarter they dedicate 2 weeks to review all the management responses that came due in the preceding 90 days.
Or they use those GRC systems we talked about.
Exactly. In more mature, automated environments, they might track them continuously, triggering a specific follow-up engagement the moment an individual due date arrives in the GRC system.
It creates a massive resource allocation challenge for the chief audit executive. How do you balance auditing the ghosts of audits past versus the new fires emerging on the horizon?
It's a delicate balancing act.
On one hand, you have a massive backlog of legacy issues you need to constantly verify. On the other hand, the technology landscape is moving at light speed. You have to dedicate resources to auditing new existential risks like generative AI deployments, complex digital supply chain vulnerabilities, and third-party vendor risks.
If an audit team spends all their time aggressively chasing down IT management for updates on 3-year-old low-risk findings, they completely miss the massive new risks forming right in front of them.
It is a constant battle of prioritization, which is why the efficiency and the rigorous methodology of the follow-up verification itself are so critical. The auditor must get in, unequivocally verify the fix, and get out.
And that leads us to Guidelines 2402.7 and 2402.8, which govern the nature and extent of follow-up activities, and specifically detail when it is appropriate to hit the pause button and defer them.
This is the trust but verify section. We need to emphasize that auditors are professionally trained to be skeptical. They do not just take management's word for it.
Never.
When an IT systems director emails the audit team and says, "Yep, we adjusted the firewall rules, go ahead and close the finding," the auditor's response is, "Great, prove it."
If we connect this to the bigger picture of enterprise governance, taking management's word without objective verification creates a profound and highly dangerous false sense of security.
It looks good on paper, but it's a lie.
The executive leadership and the board might be looking at a beautiful green dashboard showing 100% of critical audit findings resolved on time. But if none of those fixes were actually technically verified by an independent party, the enterprise is flying completely blind, operating under the illusion of security.
So what's the requirement?
Guideline 204.2.7.2 states that management's response detailing the actions taken should be evaluated, ideally by the practitioners who performed the original review, because they possess the deepest contextual understanding of the original vulnerability. And crucially, it mandates that objective audit evidence of the actions taken should be obtained.
Guideline 204/2.7.3 drives this home under verification of actions taken. It says if management provides information on actions taken, but practitioners have concerns about the accuracy of the information or the actual effectiveness of the actions, they must perform appropriate testing or other audit procedures.
They have to get into the weeds to verify the operational reality.
Let's talk about what verifying implementation actually looks like in practice, beyond just reading an email. If the finding was that an Active Directory group policy was overly permissive, allowing standard users to install unapproved software, the auditor doesn't just ask the sysadmin if they fixed it.
Right, asking isn't auditing.
The auditor needs to request an export of the current Active Directory Group Policy Objects, or GPOs, and logically verify that the specific permission string has been explicitly denied. If the finding was a missing firewall rule, the auditor demands a time-stamped export of the active firewall configuration table showing the specific port is now blocked, or they perform their own port scan to verify the block is functioning.
Exactly. You demand objective, physical, or logical evidence that cannot be easily manipulated.
Now, Guideline 24802.7.4 introduces an interesting caveat that we touched on earlier regarding the changing IT context: the reassessment of recommendation relevance.
Sometimes, significant time has passed between the original report and the scheduled follow-up. The practitioner must critically reassess if the original recommendation is still relevant to the current business environment.
Like if the business process has been completely re-engineered.
Or the vulnerable software application was entirely retired and replaced by a SaaS solution. In that case, the original recommendation to patch the old software is obsolete.
So they just drop it.
No, in those cases, the follow activity intelligently shifts to ensuring the new environment or the new SaaS provider doesn't carry the same or similar underlying risks.
And for the really massive enterprise-wide remediations, checking a single screenshot or an exported config file isn't nearly enough. Guideline 20402.7.5 notes that a whole new dedicated follow-up engagement might need to be formally scheduled just to verify the implementation of critical or highly complex actions.
You essentially spin up a mini audit with its own scope and testing procedures just to validate the fix.
And what if the auditor performs that testing and realizes management's response is totally inadequate or functionally broken?
Guideline 2402.7.6 requires that unsatisfactory responses or actions be communicated up the chain to a level of management with sufficient authority to actually force the issue and compel the IT team to try again.
However, there are times when demanding immediate verification is counterproductive and highly inefficient. Guideline 2402.8 covers deferring follow-up activities.
Based on the residual risk involved, the extreme complexity of the issues, and the sheer chronological time required to implement massive corrective actions, for instance, replacing an entire legacy enterprise resource planning, or ERP, system across a global organization, the practitioner might determine that conducting a dedicated follow-up right now is simply a waste of resources.
So they put it on ice.
Instead, Guideline 2402.8.2 allows for the follow-up procedures to be incorporated into future engagements. The actual verification is formally rolled into the next regularly scheduled audit of that specific business unit or system. It optimizes audit resources while ensuring the risk remains on the radar and is eventually evaluated.
It is a highly practical concession to reality. You don't want to harass the IT operations team every single week for a year while they're in the middle of a massive, agonizing, high-risk system migration.
It creates unnecessary friction.
You just make sure that verify the migration actually resolved the historical access control issues, becomes step one of the audit plan for the following year.
Exactly.
Moving forward, let's examine the documented requirements in Guidelines 21402.9 and 2402.long, which deal with the format of responses and the critical interplay with external auditors. There is an absolute, undeniable rule in the world of auditing and compliance. If it isn't documented in writing, it simply didn't happen.
From a legal, regulatory, and structural standpoint, oral assurances are practically worthless when an enterprise is trying to prove due diligence to a regulator or defend itself in post-breach litigation.
Guideline 2402.9.1 explicitly states that the most effective way to receive follow-up responses is in writing. A written response unequivocally reinforces management's ownership of the issue and ensures a highly accurate, indisputable historical record of actions, assigned responsibilities, and current status.
Now, the guideline does concede that oral responses are sometimes provided in fast-paced environments, but with a massive mandatory condition. They must be immediately recorded by the practitioners and, if possible, formally approved by management, ideally accompanied by actual documented proof of action.
So if a frantic network engineer stops you in the hallway and says, "Hey, we finally applied that firmware update to the core routers last night," the auditor's immediate action is to write an email.
Stating exactly what was said.
Per our hallway conversation, I am documenting that you have applied the firmware update to the core routers as of last night. Please reply approved to this email and attach the system log showing the successful firmware version. That is how you translate an oral response into defensible audit evidence.
And for those massive multi-year projects we just talked about, like the ERP migration, Guideline 2402.9.2 says practitioners should request periodic progress updates.
You don't wait 2 years in total silence and hope it works out. You demand quarterly written updates to evaluate the milestones and ensure the remediation project hasn't completely derailed.
Furthermore, we must recognize that internal audit teams do not exist in a vacuum. They are part of a broader assurance ecosystem.
Guideline 2402.10 specifically covers the follow-up on external audit recommendations, which is incredibly important for publicly traded companies or highly regulated entities.
External auditors, like the Big Four accounting firms, who come in to certify financial statements under Sarbanes-Oxley or assess regulatory compliance, might only visit the enterprise once a year.
They don't live there.
No, they do not have the constant on-the-ground presence to track every single minor remediation effort throughout the year. Therefore, depending on the scope and the specific terms of the engagement letters, external practitioners frequently rely on the internal IT audit team to perform these follow-up procedures on their behalf.
That is a massive transfer of liability. If I'm an internal IT auditor and I verify a fix regarding financial reporting controls, and the Big Four external auditor relies on my paperwork to sign off on the company's SOX compliance, I am carrying an immense amount of weight.
You are.
If I rubber stamp a bad fix, I am not just failing my internal board, I could be contributing to a material weakness in the public financial statements.
Exactly. The external auditors are governed by their own standards, like the PCAOB standards in the United States, which strictly dictate how and when they can rely on the work of internal auditors. They will assess the competence and objectivity of the internal audit function before relying on their follow-ups.
And if the internal team is solid.
If the internal IT audit team has a Rigorous, well-documented, evidence-based follow-up process aligned with ITAF 2402, the external auditors can confidently rely on that work, saving the enterprise millions of dollars in external audit fees and significantly reducing audit fatigue on the IT department.
The internal team essentially becomes the continuous enforcing arm for the external firm's recommendations.
That's a great way to put it.
Which brings us to the climax of the entire follow-up lifecycle. We are looking at Guideline 2402.11, the reporting of follow-up activities. How do we close the loop and officially report the final verified status back to the very top of the enterprise?
Guideline 2402.11.1 establishes the baseline requirement. A formal status report of all agreed-on corrective actions must go to the appropriate level of management and to those charged with governance.
Crucially, this report must explicitly highlight any recommendations that have not been implemented.
This specific reporting step provides immense strategic governance value. The board of directors or the audit committee does not have the time or the technical expertise to read a 500-page, highly technical IT audit report detailing specific port configurations and encryption algorithms.
I'd never get through it.
But they absolutely need to see a concise, aggregated status report that says, we had 50 critical IT vulnerabilities identified across the enterprise this year. Management successfully remediated, and we verified 45 of them. However, 5 critical findings remain open, unmitigated, and are now severely past due.
That high-level visibility allows the board to apply pressure precisely where it is needed, holding specific executives accountable for the delays.
But Guideline 2402.11.2 sets up what is arguably the ultimate gotcha scenario in the auditing profession.
It covers the reporting of unimplemented actions that were previously claimed to be implemented. If management previously reported an item to the board as implemented and closed, but a subsequent audit or a routine follow-up test reveals that it is, in fact, not implemented, maybe the patch was rolled back or the new process was entirely abandoned after a month, the practitioner must report this discrepancy immediately to management and those charged with governance.
And force them to generate a new corrective action plan and a new date. We need to fully explore the severity of this specific scenario because it strikes at the very heart of corporate governance.
When an IT executive claims a critical control is fixed when it isn't, whether that misrepresentation occurs through genuine misunderstanding of the technology, operational incompetence, or deliberate malicious deception to protect their bonus, it creates a massive, extremely dangerous blind spot for the board of directors.
The board is making massive strategic decisions. Perhaps acquiring another company, expanding into a heavily regulated market like the European Union, or launching a new digital product based on the foundational assumption that their digital infrastructure is secure and compliant.
If they have been told a critical data privacy gap was successfully closed, they will operate with a false sense of security.
When the auditor uncovers that the fix was an illusion or a temporary Band-Aid, it shatters that trust. The immediate mandatory escalation required by 2402.11.2 ensures that the blind spot is illuminated instantly.
Forcing management to answer to the board for the discrepancy and recommit to a permanent, verifiable solution. It essentially prevents management from marking their own homework and giving themselves an A.
And finally, when the dust settles, the budget is spent, the late nights are over, and the work is actually done, Guideline 2402.11.3 provides the formal closure.
When all the agreed-on corrective actions have been implemented and the auditor has objectively verified the evidence, a conclusive report detailing all the completed actions is forwarded to executive management and governance.
You get to officially close the book on that specific audit engagement. The vulnerability is mitigated, the evidence is archived, and the enterprise is demonstrably safer than it was before the audit began.
It is the ultimate validation that the entire IT audit framework, from the initial risk assessment and charter creation to the execution of complex technical testing, right through to the grueling follow-up negotiations, actually functioned as designed.
It empirically proves that the enterprise has the mature capacity to identify its own weaknesses, commit resources to improvement, and relentlessly follow through to elevate its overall resilience and digital trust in a hostile cyber environment.
That is a true masterclass in corporate accountability. And that wraps up our deep dive into the ITAF 5th edition, Chapter 4, specifically Reporting Standard 1402 and Guidelines 2402.
We've explored the entire life cycle.
From the mandatory, non-negotiable demands of the standards that force escalation, to the nitty-gritty tracking, automated GRC systems, and evidence verification processes, all the way to the final high-stakes reports delivered to the board of directors. It really makes you appreciate the meticulous, almost exhausting nature of IT audit follow-ups and how critical they are to the survival of modern organizations.
If you take away anything from this session, let it be the understanding that finding the flaw is only 10% of the battle. Having the operational discipline to verify the fix is the other 90%.
The value of knowledge, particularly regarding your own vulnerabilities, is only realized through application and relentless follow-through.
Identifying a critical infrastructure flaw without the institutional commitment to rectify and verify it is essentially an exercise in highly documented futility. The ITA framework provides the necessary architecture to ensure that the pursuit of digital trust is not just a theoretical governance concept, but a verified operational reality that protects the enterprise and its stakeholders.
Beautifully synthesized. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with a lingering thought to mull over, building on what we discussed regarding management's ability to formally accept risk. Think about this. If an enterprise develops an internal culture of endlessly deferring audit follow-ups, prioritizing speed to market over security, and consistently accepting every residual risk just to save time and capital in the short term, at what point does their stated risk appetite simply become documented organizational negligence?
And in a hyper-connected global economy that is entirely driven by digital trust and data security, how long until the market, the regulators, or the threat actors figure that out?
We will leave you to ponder that. Thank you for joining us as fellow instructors on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.